Ken Burns' The American Revolution series on PBS might look fresh and sound fresh because, oh my gosh, it acknowledges slavery. It includes women, daughters of liberty, and indigenous people. And it presents the American Revolutionary War as bloody and divisive. It was a civil war. But it's all 1950s history, folks. It's consensus school historiography, the same nationalist framework, the same teleology, the same centered actors, with 1960s and 70s social history texture slapped on for your 2026 consumption. I'm Tad Sturmer. I'm a historian of the American Revolution and resistance history at the University of Southern Denmark and Johns Hopkins, and the author of A Resistance History of the United States. Ken Burns does the predictable thing. He nods to inclusivity, he acknowledges marginalized voices, but only insofar as they support the mainstream patriot story. They're important to the extent they can be absorbed into the white patriot first narrative. They have to share in that identity, not challenge it. The challengers can be distinguished and dismissed fairly quickly and adeptly. Ken Burns told Time about this project. The American Revolution is the most important, consequential revolution in history. We then spend the next 12 hours trying to prove it. It's a mission statement. The conclusion drives the investigation. That's not history, folks. That's nationalist propaganda with better production values. He wants to, quote, put the us back in the U.S., end quote, by showing we were more divided then than now. Classic consensus move. Acknowledge conflict to assert deeper unity. And either way, you're not doing history. You're nation building. You're identity weaving. But the consensus school did just that. It dominated American historiography from the late 1940s, coming out of the World War II patriot myth era, through the early 1960s. Hofstadter, Hartz, Boorstin, Edmund Morgan to a certain extent, Potter, reacting against progressive historians like Charles Beard, Arthur Schlesinger Sr., who emphasized class conflict and economic interests. Consensus historians said Americans shared fundamental values: property rights, individual liberty, capitalism, constitutional government. Conflict was superficial. Core principles were what mattered. And it's Cold War historiography. It's produced by these ex-leftists, for the most part, who'd soured on communism. So it emerges from fighting fascism into battling Soviets, emphasizing American unity, serving clear ideological purposes. And what made it powerful and insidious? It claimed objectivity. It presented itself as just describing reality, not making arguments. Americans really were unified by founding principles. Historians were just recognizing facts. Slavery became an aberration, not foundational. Women and indigenous people disappeared. Class conflict was un-American. And John Hickham's 1959 critique of them exposed how this homogeneous conception of the past erased all of the actual conflicts. New left historians finished it off in the 1960s and 70s, centering what consensus history had largely erased: race, class, gender, social movements, ordinary people. Demographic transformation of the profession, women, Black, Latino, Asian scholars, made the unity fiction unsustainable. But consensus history shaped two generations, dominating textbooks, popular histories, public discourse from 1950 to 1975. Anyone born and raised in that period, Ken Burns, born in 1953, Steven Spielberg, born in 1946, boomer filmmakers, journalists, public intellectuals, absorbed all of that. America's exceptional. The founding is unifying. The Constitution represents shared principles. American history was progress toward realizing those principles, and that's it. But after the consensus school collapsed in academia, it kept structuring popular understanding because those storytellers, film, television, museums, had been educated in it. They learned it young. It's their baseline. You can update it with social history, become sensitive towards it, add marginalized voices, acknowledge ugly realities. But if the fundamental structure remains, America was founded on shared principles that ultimately unified us, you are still doing 1950s consensus history. Gordon Wood, who's 92, and Joe Ellis, who's 82, anchor that. They both maintained what Ellis called the older classic questions about founding principles. In 2018, they whined together that social and cultural history was overshadowing positive founding narratives. But Atkinson, Schiff, Philbrick, they're not scholars, they're popular writers. And the diversity voices in this, Maya Jasanoff on loyalists, Annette Gordon-Reed on slavery, Chris Brown on abolitionism, Black Hawk and Duvall on indigenous people and women, serious scholars doing important work, but slotted into Wood and Ellis's and Atkinson's framework. Texture and inclusivity without challenging nationalist teleology. Jasanoff's Loyalist Diaspora, Gordon-Reed's Enslaved People, Brown's Atlantic Abolitionist Networks, supporting characters to a 1950s story. Modern historiography of the American Revolution and the American Revolutionary War doesn't work that way. I've been doing this for 20 years. It doesn't treat the Revolution and the Constitution and independence as part of the same inevitable event. It doesn't center, how did America become America? I don't care, not my job. Our job is to tell you how things happened, when they did, the way they did, and to get as close as we can to the truth so that you can figure that out for yourself and assigning any kind of values to it. We ask questions like, whose revolution was it? Whose war for independence? Which resistance movement succeeded? Which got crushed? Why? How did imperial crises create multiple contested futures? It situates the revolution in Atlantic and hemispheric context. Dutch revolt 150 years earlier, Haiti more radical, America one contingent outcome among many possible worlds. Burns can't engage that scholarship without abandoning his premise that the American Revolution was the most important consequential revolution in history. It would require treating the founding not as an origin of unity, but just as one contested outcome. Most alternatives foreclosed by violence. It would require seeing the Constitution not as a fulfillment of revolutionary principles, but as a betrayal. And would require placing America in a world of revolutions, not treating it as exceptional. Instead, Burns does what consensus historians did. He acknowledges complexity and conflict, surprises you with it. He includes marginalized voices. He absorbs everything into American unity and exceptionalism. The marginalized matter insofar as they contributed to America, not as people with their own goals, their own visions of freedom, their own insistence on achieving liberty, and their own resistance movements the founding co-opted or crushed, or that they succeeded in making Black loyalists anybody. 1950s history, conditioned by 1960s and 70s social sensitivities, by a 72-year-old filmmaker educated in consensus tradition for 2026. And it's the same function that consensus history has always served, reassuring Americans that despite conflicts, we're unified by founding principles. Our country deserves better than nationalist mythology with diversity window dressing.